So I want to talk about non-consequentialist ethics, and I want to start with talking about the end of the world. And here's what I mean. Probably the most famous kind of post-Enlightenment, kind of leading into the modern era, non-consequentialist philosopher is Immanuel Kant. And the Kantian philosophical revolution has been compared in some ways to the Copernican revolution, right? So Copernicus, right, everybody, everywhere thinks that the sun goes around the Earth. Why do they think that? Well, that's what you see, right? Anybody who thinks that all the ancients were just totally unscientific and stupid and backwards and superstitious, no, when they were looking at the world around them, they're looking at what can they see. They don't have airplanes, they don't have spaceships, they don't have telescopes until Galileo. Copernicus is kind of revolutionary, right? You kick the Earth out from the center. And Copernicus wasn't completely right. Copernicus wanted to put everything as circles. He cheated on the math to make sure everything was like perfect circles, perfect spheres. Kepler's the one who came along with ellipses. And interestingly enough, Kepler was very interested with getting certain numerical realities because he wanted, there was just still this sort of Renaissance influenced desire for a sort of perfection in the universe, beyond the scope, beyond the sort of sphere of the moon, things had to be perfect. But that said, Kant, in his philosophical efforts to talk about morality and reality, really philosophy, what we can know, he's often compared to the Copernican revolution in relation to what we see in cosmology. Kant is compared to in epistemology and ethics. Epistemology is the study with how we know and what we know. Cosmology being the makeup of the universe, right? So we get to this question, right? We're dealing with this question of grounding. If you're not going to have God at the center, which we'll come back to God, obviously that's what much of the semester is going to be about, is God in relation to morality, morality in relation to God. But I want to really fully deal with where we're coming from within our own culture and this question of grounding. How do you ground morality if you're going to throw religion out? How has the post-Enlightenment, modern, postmodern world really tried to wrestle with this, right? What are you going to ground it in? What do you do in reality? What is reality? This is a huge question. If you remember, when we talk about reality, right? When you think about the egoism, which we ended the last lecture with, is we dealt with egoism some, right? And Ayn Rand would talk about rational self-interest, and I asked the question, well, what makes something rational? It's grounding in reality. So when we talk about things, in philosophy, we have different branches within philosophy of ontology, which is the study of what is real, metaphysics, physics, what is the physical universe, what is beyond the physical universe, kind of what's the overarching reality. That's all ontological study. Epistemology is the study of how we know, and ethics is kind of the study of how should we act, what should we do. And these three areas, there's also aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, but for our purposes, we're going to stick with ontology, epistemology, and ethics, and this question of reality. Whether it's Ayn Rand or some utilitarian like Bentham or Mill, whatever you're going to say is good, whatever you're going to say is right, is going to have to be rooted in rationality. Rationality has to do with reality. And I think I've shown you this before, that the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prayer question of what story or stories do I find myself. There's a shift, and I'm going to have to back up. Oh, no. Okay, so there's a shift in the focus of philosophy after Hume, starting with Kant, really, in that Hume wants to say, if you remember, Hume said there's this is-ought problem. He denies cause and effect because you can't see it. He's a radical skeptic. and he wants to say that we it challenges we can't really know anything metaphysical, and Kant is going to say, oh, that's a problem. Like we need cause and effect. Kant wants morality as a steady thing. So the study of ontology, what is real, this focus on metaphysics and physics, a lot of philosophers after Hume and then Kant want to move away from any idea of an overarching reality and just talk about the kind of boots on the ground, what's right in front of you, kind of the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, maybe biology, that tells us something about reality. But beyond that, we're really into conjecture. And so the question becomes, how do we know what we know? How can we know? And there's these debates between rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism being the mind is central, reasoning is central, empiricism is the senses, and observation is central, reason follows. And then there are debates in ethics. If we study ethics, can we study what you should do? That would be normative. We're telling you how to act. Or is ethics merely to be reduced to what people do, descriptive ethics? Kant wants to save some aspect of rational, empirical, kind of combined, this sort of rationalism influenced by a strong scientific empiricism so that he can preserve cause and effect. And he wants to preserve a philosophical basis for a normative ethic, an ethical system that says this is how you should act. But all that comes down to that question of what is real. Think about the thing that Ayn Rand said, rational self-interest. Or let's take it to another level. Rational has to do with what's real. If we say someone has an irrational fear, right, what do we mean by that? Well, it's a fear of something beyond the scope of reality. So if there are no ghosts, if there are no demons, if there are no spirits, then this fear of haunting would be an irrational fear. If they do exist, then it's not an irrational fear. Now, you can have an irrational fear of something real. You can have an irrational fear of snakes where, I won't even go into like a snake exhibit in a zoo where everything's behind glass, nothing's getting out, but I just freak out because I'm in any proximity to a snake. That might be an irrational fear. Because why? It's denying something about reality. That it's not denying. It's not that snakes don't exist. They do, but it's denying something else about reality, or it's wrong about something else. It assumes that this glass casings can't protect me from the snakes. So when we talk about what's rational, it's rooted in what's real, or what's irrational is somehow related to what is not real. So this question of how do we know things is really important. If we want to talk about our actions being rooted in a rational self-interest, well, then we have to know, what is real, what is really in our own interest, what is real about what it means to be human, what is real about other humans, what is real about our duties to other humans. So there's a lot of questions we have to answer there. So when we think about, though, this question of rationalism versus empiricism, once you get into the Renaissance and right after the Renaissance moving up into the Enlightenment, there's this huge debate leading into what forms the foundation of modern thinking, which is between rationalism and empiricism. What the mind is primary, the senses are secondary, or the senses are primary and the mind is secondary. Galileo, famous for the telescope, observation, right? Observation is the key. Observation is central. What you can know is based on, to some degree, what you can see, what you can't see. So that's Galileo says, if the ears, the tongue, and the nostrils were taken away, the figure, the motions, and the numbers would indeed remain, but not the odors, nor the taste, nor the sounds, which without the living animal I do not believe are anything else than names. Having now seen that many affections which are reputed to be qualities residing in the external object have truly no other existence than in us. So what is real, right? Galileo is saying, What's real is the things that can be measured apart from us: shape, motion, numbers. But things like smell, taste, color, these aren't as real. They're subjective versus objective things, right? Well, there are some real problems with that. That's an extreme empiricist. Sorry, that's an extreme empirical view. For one thing, like I think I've mentioned this before, right? If I tell you there's a whiteboard and there's an infinite number of squares on that whiteboard, that's meaningless to you because you can't see those squares. Even though, what does Galileo say? The shape is something real, color is not. Well, it's color differentiation that makes us able to see the shapes. So this is part of what shapes our thinking, in a sense, right? There's in the philosophy of science, there's a lot of discussion now about what really is there anything that has existence apart from us, right? And this is the age-old philosophical question: if the tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Yes, no. People argue about this thing. Why? Well, it's a question of what's really real apart from the observing subject. What objects are really real? What really matters? Leslie Newbigin is a theologian, Christian theologian. He says that ever since Descartes, we have been seduced by a kind of knowledge which could not be doubted. Newbigin makes a good point. I think my only contention is really this goes back to before Descartes. When you read Plato and all of the discussions that Socrates has in Plato's dialogues, right? Socrates is looking for those things that are true knowledge as opposed to simply opinion. He's not saying that opinion doesn't matter. He wants the most informed opinion he can have, but he's looking for things that are undoubtable knowledge. They really are true. That's what Descartes' looking for. Descartes is famous for cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. What's he saying? Your reality, the thing that you can be absolutely certain of is based in your mind. You are a thinking thing. And this strongly shapes our way of thinking about ethics and everything else. Why? Because what is primary is the knowing subject, not the experienced objects. Hume is this, like I mentioned before, right? He's this skeptic. He says, as opposed to Descartes, he says human life is incompatible with rationality, and that human endeavors always extend beyond philosophical justification. I may have ventured to affirm to the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle and collection of different perceptions. This is an extreme empiricism. This is the opposite of Descartes, right? It's not the reasoning pulling together of sensations that makes reality. It's just the sensations. Everything else is just a fiction that you make up to kind of organize yourself. So these are the big questions of what is human nature. And that question is important because to know how I should behave is going to be related to what is real about humans. Something else is going on at this time is there's this, you have the Enlightenment in the late 1600s, all through the 1700s, coming, following the Renaissance, this Enlightenment period. Reason takes precedent. And until you get to the French Revolution and the goddess reason is everything, and then there's this kind of counter movement, this counter revolution, counter reaction of the Romantic movement. We've gotten too much focused on reason. Everything is about feelings. So we talk about personal autonomy, individual rights, freedom, human rights, the common good. We start to wrestle with all these things in conflict with each other, right? My individual self versus the common, the other humans. How does freedom relate to all this? And we start struggling with how do we ground any kind of morality that deals with my personal autonomy versus the common good, my individual rights versus everybody else's rights, right? All those things we saw with Ayn Rand, with John Stuart Mill. If you have any experience in public health ethics, I've done a good bit of grad work, study in public health ethics. A reasonable amount. And a lot of when you read documents from public health ethics organizations, groups of ethicists trying to form policies. They're constantly trying to balance between personal individual rights and the common good and the larger human rights. It's like this conflict between the two is the constant focus, because there's this idea that human nature is to be this radical individual in the context of other radical individuals. And so we get a history that affects us of a kind of contractarian government. And it takes many forms. Hobbes, who said that everybody's out to get their own, so we need to form a contract to make a strong central government that'll keep everybody else's ambitions in check. Rousseau says we're all this, innocent individual until we come into society, that even the family is not really a real society. It's just there out of necessity until the child's old enough to take care of themselves. And in primitive cultures, people would live all alone and they would migrate away from each other, which is clearly not true. Rousseau never studied any so-called primitive cultures, any pre-modern cultures. If you look at them, they're always tribal, they're always family-centered. There may be intense ideas of reciprocity or of revenge, but there's always community, there's always family. That's just part of what it is to be human. So Rousseau's ideas are weird, but Rousseau's like you're this radical sort of innocent individual until you meet up with other people, and then you have to compete over property, and so then you have to form governments through a contract. Montesquieu, not quite so out there as Hobbes and Rousseau, but contractarian government's important. Montesquieu's important for the formation of the American government. Locke, we talked about him a little bit. Jefferson, even Marx, right? This idea of the proletariat, needs to rise up and take over. Why? Well, they need to form this sort of contract of a sort. They all have somewhat different views of human beings, but those somewhat different views are rooted in this divide between the individual and the community. They all have some aspect of a sort of radical individualism. So that's a big part of our sort of modern, postmodern makeup of how we understand society. So a lot of the efforts to say, well, utilitarian governments or whatever, even deontological governments, they're going to be focused on how do we get along, how do we agree, we need to make contracts. But the question becomes, why should we make the contract? Why is it binding? Why should I agree to it? We're going to talk about these a good bit more with the Credo, in relation to the Credo, because a lot of people assume that the Credo is all about contractarian government. It's about, Socrates thinks you should never disobey the government. This is not what the Credo is about. We'll talk about that some. But we always have these why questions, right? Whether we're talking as an egoist, whether we're talking as a utilitarian, whether we're going to talk today or in this lecture about deontological approaches to ethics, ethics based in duty, based in something other than consequences, right? Non-consequential ethics. If you're going to say, well, we have to make contracts to have sound government, why? What's the basis of that contract? Which still leaves us with this question of grounding. How do we ground our ethics? So we have this difficulty, this challenge of what's the basis of reality? Is it our mind or is it our experiences? We have the extremes of Descartes on the one side, I think, therefore I am. Everything's about the mind. Everything else is debatable and undependable. Versus, the Galileos or the extreme empiricist of Hume, right? But whatever approach you take, people have to work together to survive. So what do we do with that? We form contracts. But if I could get away with breaking the contract, why should it be binding? Why should I agree to it? If I can overpower some of the rest of the collective, why should I not do that? Every version of contract ethics has these same grounding problems. What is the basis for your morality? Hobbes, I mentioned this, man is a state of nature, always war, every man against every man. Or Rousseau, I mentioned the most ancient of all societies. and even in, the most ancient is the family. Even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for preservation. It's always a good idea, just as a side note, to look at the lives of philosophers when you're asking yourself, what are their ideas based in? Should I take them seriously? Rousseau was sort of a philanderer. He was not. He had children out of wedlock. He was not good at taking care of them. He left women in bad state during his life. Um, he wanted this sort of radical independence, and so yeah, he has this idea that children don't remain attached to the father after they don't need him, which I think is a sad, sad approach. I've got kids, I've got grown kids. Um, there's actually a relationship there. I don't, what makes a person come to that idea. I know there are families where that families fall apart. There's hurt, there's brokenness, but um, this idea that there's no relationship, never a relationship between father and children. It's just, and it doesn't really take into account, Rousseau's views and Hobbes' views don't take into account friendship, right? Everything is about being solitary. It's about being independent, and so that view of human nature makes it really difficult to form a solid contractarian theory of how we should come to our views of ethics, right? We can't just, why should I make any deals if I'm really in it all for myself? Um, so Kant comes onto the scene in the 1800s, in the 19th century, right? And he's seen all this discussion, the Descartes and the Galileos and the Humes and the skeptics and all these wrestlings of Rousseau and Hobbes. He's seen the French Revolution, which he clearly doesn't want to see a repeat of that. He's seen religious wars, and he says, okay, I'm done with all that. How do we study what is real? What can we study? What can we know? How do we save science? The sciences are, the physical sciences are growing. They're excelling. You have this movement towards industrialization. Kant likes those things, and he likes a stable society. You need a stable society to have a strong economy, to have industrialization. You can't have you've got to have some pretty stable rules of law. Um, and so he says, well, how do we know what we know? This becomes the question, right? What is reality? Hume has said we can't really study metaphysics. Other philosophers are saying there's no way to know what's really real. And so Kant says, you know what we can study? We can study the realm of possible experience. And so you have this branch of philosophy called phenomenology. You study the phenomenon. How we know becomes the important question. How do we know what we know? Kant makes his philosophical forays because he wants to, first of all, save the scientific world. He wants to save the validity of belief, and he wants to secure the place of reason as opposed to a radical empirical skepticism. Um, so he is a kind of moderate, I would say rationalist. He says all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. He's trying to bring together this sort of empirical, rational way of thinking. Alan Wood, which is one of the primary scholars and translators of Kant's work, says that Kant was a man of scientific temperament whose chief concerns were the growth of human knowledge and the intellectual and moral development of the human species. He had no patience at all for the mystical or the miraculous. He was deeply skeptical of popular religious culture, severely disapproving of religious ceremonies, and downright hostile to the whole idea of ecclesiastical, that's church leadership authority. In the context of Kant's time, this did not mean that he was unbelieving or irreligious. It merely signified that his religious temper was enlightened rather than conservative or enthusiastic. In other words, he's not interested in intense maintaining of sort of traditional church structures, nor does he want some kind of mystical, spiritual, revivalistic religion. He wants sort of deism. There's a God who set everything into motion, and life's going to go better if you figure that out. But at the same time, the God is not the most important part. The structures of life are what's important to Kant. Um, what's he trying to save the world from? Again, well, the insanity of the French Revolution is one of them, right? Supposedly reason was the goddess, but it was very unreasonable. By the end of it, you have just this slaughter of people. Um, he's wanting to base this on the idea of, what Copernicus did with cosmology. He wants to do with philosophy and metaphysics and ethics and morals, right? So he says the rational mind has a certain structure, and anything known must be known in terms of that structure. But he says that structure gives us limits, and so there's those limits say, well, there are walls there, but that allows for a certain amount of kind of conjecture and investigation beyond the boundaries. You can push the envelope. That's transcendental investigation. That's when you can start to think about, is it reasonable to believe in a God, right? That's transcendental investigation. What is it that I can know with certain reasonableness? Based on that, is it reasonable to think there could be a God or something like that? Um, this is the philosophy of phenomenology, which is rooted in Kant. The idea is that the noumenal is things that exist as they are. The phenomenal is the appearance of the things, and Kant says humans only know the phenomenal. You can't know what really exists because, if you remember that narratives article, right? You're shaped by your stories, you're shaped by your own experiences. Your experiences and your stories are limited. That's how you interpret everything. Everything you know is known by way of interpreting. It's mediated to you. You have no direct access to anything. Everything is mediated. And so maybe the phenomenal world, maybe the world of appearances is real, but maybe it's not. And we seem to have enough human experience to know that sometimes what we think we see or experience turns out not to be true. We have conflicting experiences and we have to dismiss one and accept the other. Kant would say the concept of God and even the conviction of his existence can be met with only in reason, and it cannot come first to us either through inspiration or through tidings communicated to us, however great the authority behind them. Only reason, by means of its moral principles, is capable of having produced the concept of God. There's a couple of important things to think about here that we'll come back to through the semester as we talk about God and morality and religion and morality. Kant is saying that you can't know anything about God that comes to you through tidings communicated through others or inspiration. Well, he's thinking you can't trust your own inspiration. It may just be your emotions. And tidings, well, that's just news from somebody else. You have to experience it for yourself. But that's actually contradictory. Science only works if we accept tidings of previous scientists, right? We have to accept certain things in order to do certain other things. He overstates his case here, right? In reality, human knowledge requires inspiration and tidings from other people. It's the only way we can know. We have to base our observations and our reasoning on the tidings that we've already received and on the mental inspiration of making at least connections in the natural world. However, the second statement here, only reason by means of its moral principles is capable of having produced the concept of God. This is going to be important at the end of the semester to some degree when we talk about the arguments for God. One of the primary arguments for God's existence is the argument from morality, right? There's this morality. If there is absolute or objective morality, they'll claim there must be a God. I'm not going to go into the full argument right now, but this is something that Kant's views would support. Why does Kant say this? He doesn't say that morality proves God, but he says if there are morals, if morals really are real, right? Well, then that gives you good reason to believe in God, and here's why. And I'm just going to touch on it because we're going to, in the end of the semester, we're really going to delve into this. But Kant's thinking is that transcendental investigation, right? There are limits to what you can know. Your experiences are limited, but you can, to some reasonable extent, know that certain things are always wrong and certain things are always right. And if you know that, well, it can cause you problems, right? If I should never murder, if I should be concerned about the well-being of others, even sometimes to the sacrifice of my own well-being, right? Is that ever the reality? Should I ever be willing to sacrifice my own well-being for another person's? Kant's going to say, yeah, there's sometimes you have to do something right, and doing the right thing is going to cost you potentially your life. Well, that's not fair if there is no God. There really that would seem to devalue the concept of justice, and justice is very important. So Kant is saying because doing the right thing at some point may require you to give up life, there would seem to be that would seem to be an evidence that maybe there's something beyond this life, that there will be justice in the long run. Now, for Kant, you can't prove that, but it does act evidentially. Just very briefly, this is sort of an image of what Kant is going to say. Humans exist in a world where we have just this loads of uninterpreted data over here, just constantly coming in. Realize that your brain filters out so much data at every point. Okay, but you have these ordering principles of the mind, time, space, various categories of reality, like cause and effect. That's one of the categories, is cause and effect. This is how your mind shapes the data. It interprets it. This is that point of nothing you experience is really unmediated. Whatever, number one, your mind closes out so much data or you would be crippled. Number two, whatever you take in is automatically being filtered through various categories of how you understand reality. To start with, categories of the mind, ordering principles of the mind, Kant calls them. So Kant is, again, he wants to criticize taking knowledge from other people, from what people have written, from experts, from teachers, from past philosophers, from religion, from whatever, because you have to have the courage to use your own reason. The motto of the Enlightenment is dare to know. You should get rid of all tutelage, right? The ability, again, I would contend that this is really idealistic. It's not possible. You have to accept some things. That's just part of human existence. You have to accept some things from people who've gone before you. How many things could you not know if you're not going to listen to anyone about what has been or what already is? Right? It's not that you shouldn't test it or can't test it. Reason can. Dare to know is maybe a great motto. But the question is, can you know apart from others contributing to your knowledge? This again goes back to that. This is one point that I want you to see in the modern era. There's this radical individualism that just isn't realistic for human existence. We don't live that way. We can't live that way. You were born in a context that you have so little control over, and it shapes you before you ever have your first thought about being shaped. So all that said, I want you to understand sort of the underlying background philosophy to both consequential and non-consequential ethics. Kant is essential for understanding the really the modern slash postmodern sense of non-consequential ethics. Some non-consequential ethics are very old because they're rooted in religion. But when we're talking about kind of post-Enlightenment, modern, non-religious ethics, Kant is sort of the go-to for non-consequentialism. He has that whole Enlightenment view of human nature, very individualized. Kant at one point says, man must be disciplined for he is by nature raw and wild, right? Note these ought sort of questions, these value-laden kind of moral statements, wording, right? Man must be disciplined. Why? If his nature is raw and wild, what about it requires that it must be disciplined? You're saying it ought to be. Why ought it to be something other than what it is? I mean, that's one of the questions. The Romantic movement is going to say, hey, yeah, man is raw and wild. Why are you going to try to discipline? Why are you going to restrain him? Let him be what he wants to be, right? Callicles in the Gorgias and Plato, going way back, way before the Romantic era, right? Callicles is like, how you just you're cowards and you're weaklings. You try to restrain the raw and wild nature of the human. Well, no, why must he be disciplined, Mr. Kant? That's the question. Now, Kant's deontological. His sort of non-consequential ethic is called deontological. It's duty-based. He says there is therefore only one categorical imperative. It is act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. What's he saying there? Okay, categorical imperative means a command. It's a command that's not just contextualized to a simple context, but it's across the board, always the case. You should always act according to the maximum rule, a rule that you could be okay with everybody else making it a rule that applies to you as well, right? So I shouldn't murder someone because I don't want someone to murder me. It's really a very philosophically precise way of saying the golden rule, right? Confucius once said, "Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you." Jesus, quoting the Hebrew scriptures from Leviticus, I think, maybe Deuteronomy, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." It's called the golden rule. Kant's essentially saying that. He's saying that because, because humans are an end in themselves. He says so. Act the categorical imperative. We see the second principle. Those are kind of his main rules of his duty ethic. You saw the categorical imperative. The next one is the principle of reversibility. Right, that's part of it. You don't do anything that you wouldn't want done to you. You must understand that other people are not mere means to one's own ends. He emphasizes mere means because we all use each other as a means to an end, but there's proper and improper ways, according to this, to do that. Right? I'm a means to an end for you. I'm doing my best to teach you about philosophy and ethics. But you shouldn't disrespect me or treat me like a piece of property, right? You're a means to an end for me. Your students, because you're there, because you need to be taught, I get a paycheck for teaching you. But I need to do the best I can and not just kind of phone it in and do it half-heartedly. I should try to get you your grades in a timely manner, and I do try. Not always the fastest, but I do try. Right? Because I should try to make this experience not just the minimal requirement, but I should treat you as something of value in yourself. I shouldn't act disrespectfully towards you. You shouldn't act disrespectfully towards me, even if we could get away with it in our context, right? This is what he means by not treating others as a mere means. It's called the practical imperative. Whatever you do virtuous, do it not only for your own selfish reasons, right? Because it's the moral thing to do. To use each other simply for our own ends is immoral, he's going to say. His duty ethic says it's not merely based on laws. Laws can be good or bad laws, right? It's not just the laws. It's the ethics. It's the reality, the morality behind the laws. It's rooted in the idea of the goodwill. You want to live in a good society. You want to have relationships with other people. Notice in Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, it's one of his early works. He critiques the ancients. He critiques Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle pretty harshly at some points. But there are frequently times where Kant really sounds a lot like Socrates. If you think about in the Gorgias, right? If you think about the point in the Gorgias where Socrates is contending with Callicles, and he says, you want justice, you want order, you want temperance, you want to be an ordered soul, because if you're not, you can't have friendship. You can't. You need the goodwill. You need relationships with other people, and those depend upon treating each other in certain ways with certain respect, which requires self-restraint, right? So there's some echoes of what Socrates said in Plato in Kant's Ethics. He does say that to be moral in action must be voluntary. If you have to do it, if you're forced to do it, if you just have a nice personality, if you're a very pleasant person, if you're just afraid of being punished, or it's just your natural impulse, then it's not moral. You have to actually make the decision for it to be moral. This is interesting because this is a place where he would in some ways be in conflict with traditional morals. Because most traditional morals say the point is to try to become the person for whom the impulse and the drive is to do the right thing. That you're trying to become that person. You're trying to become a virtuous person. So you don't have to think it through every time because it becomes a sort of second nature to you. You become a good person. If you become a good person, you'll do good things. But it would seem like on some level that Kant's saying if you became a good person, you could no longer be moral because you would just have already taught yourself to naturally do the right thing, and now you're not making choices anymore. You're doing by an impulse or what kind of comes naturally. So, you know, it may not be a fully fair view of Kant, but in fairness to that, he is very critical of virtue ethics positions. So it's only fair to kind of counter critique him. He says morality is to be discovered through pure reason, not by law or consequences. So at some point he says, where we saw this, acts in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. And then he goes on to say, man must be disciplined, for he is by nature raw and wild. So we have some why questions on this, right? I'm going to always come back to that why. Why do you say this? What's your grounding for this? What's the basis, the foundation for saying this, right? Nietzsche's very critical of Kant. Nietzsche says of Kant, the spectacle of the tartuffery of the old Kant, equally stiff and decent, subtle tricks of old moralists and ethical preachers. Tartuffe is a play where the main character is an obvious hypocrite. Nietzsche's saying Kant's an old hypocrite. He's teaching you morality. He's saying he's not going to teach you, you know, old style morality where you should do what, mind your manners, be decent, be kind, But then he just claims to give you a pure reason for doing all the things that all the moral preachers have ever said to do. So that's kind of Nietzsche's critique of Kant. My critique of Kant is, some things I've kind of mentioned in passing, right? If you say the concept of God can be met with only in reason, cannot come first to us either through inspiration or through tidings communicated to us, however great the authority behind them. Right? Think of all the things we know through quote unquote tidings. What are tidings? It's somebody else communicating a message of things that happen. All of history you know because you got through tidings from a person with authority. You can say, well, there's archaeology, but archaeology has to be interpreted, and usually we try to interpret it by comparing what? Tidings from different people on different sides of the debate, and then we look at the archaeological finds. No archaeologist would be taken seriously if they had multiple writings from multiple perspectives, found an artifact that fit to some degree with one of the perspectives and to some degree with the other perspective, but primarily, supported the one perspective from the historical document. If that archaeologist wrote and said, well, I know that these people who lived at that time said this and this and this, and this object relates to that, but I don't think it's that at all. I think, aliens flew down and stuck it here and has nothing to do with anything that either of those people wrote. It's just, I don't know, I'm being a little facetious, but the point being, you have to take tidings of others. How do you even know how to study science? How do you know what a cell is, right? How do you know that a microscope works or how to use it? How do you know whether a telescope works or how to use it? There's so much that you have to accept based on instruction from others before you can ever begin reasoning about it, right? There's so many facts and methods and processes that someone else has to teach you. So when he talks about only reason by means of his moral principles is capable of having produced the concept of God, why only reason? What is reason? Reason is a combination of everything we experience, everything we hear from others. Our reason involves a process and it involves a lot of input. You can't divorce reason from either perception or from instruction, right? We interpret, our reason interprets based on things that we've already been told. Immanuel Kant is in some sense interpreting how we know based on Enlightenment ideas of how we know. So he says all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. Why not? Right? Why do you give? I mean, Galileo didn't agree. Hume didn't agree. Just because you say it's so doesn't mean it's so, right? This is the challenge. This is the whole challenge to the debate. He's taking a side in the debate. That's fine, right? But so, we don't want this self-encouraged tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Every human being must start their reason with instruction from another human being. That's just the reality of a human existence. Otherwise, we would have to start with nothing. We'd have to reinvent the wheel and rediscover fire, recreate the lens, right? How do you know that what you're seeing through a lens is actually what it's doing, right? Sure, have courage to use your own reason, but you have to use your own reason as it is informed by others. So what is human nature, right? This is the big question, because we're going to talk about grounding, whether consequential or non-consequential ethics, right? Human nature, is it individualistic? Is it communal? How do those relate? Going back to Kant's ethics, why, Nietzsche's going to say, why can't I treat others as a mere means if they're subpar human beings, right? Ayn Rand, her philosophy of objectivism, says that, hey, some people are just not worth much, and I shouldn't have to bother with them. If they don't care, if they don't work hard, if they're just a couch potato and lazy, well, let them die. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. That why should I have to be bothered with them, right? Humans aren't, for Ayn Rand, for Nietzsche, humans aren't valuable just because they're humans. You need to produce something. When you're producing something of value, well, wait, what's of value? Right? Why is that of value and that not of value? Just because Ayn Rand says it? Just because Nietzsche says it? Right? There are all these questions of why, for the consequentialist, for the non-consequentialist, right? Kant, why can't I treat someone as a mere means to an end? I mean, if I can't prove there's a God, I can't prove there's an afterlife, why should I ever sacrifice myself for your morality, Kant? Why should I believe you that your morality is reasonable? If doing the so-called right thing is going to end my life 30 years earlier, potentially, why should I do the right thing if I can't know that there's an afterlife? Right? I mean, these are serious questions. What is it to be human? What's human nature? This reality is the basis of rationality. And so that's the challenge for us as we go further in the study of ethics. That's the critique of much of both consequential and non-consequential ethics in our study in the modern world, in the postmodern world. How do we ground our morality if we're going to dismiss the idea of God, if we're going to dismiss the ideas of all religions, if we're going to dismiss the idea of life after death? What kind of morality do you want? What kind of morality can you ground in the reality of human nature? What is human nature? We're going to come to this again and again. Hopefully, if you've already read the Plato readings, you've seen, as I've drawn attention to it, some of the relation of Plato's wrestling alongside of sort of modern ideas that are maybe not so modern. We find them in Paulus and Gorgias and Callicles and Crito. So we'll talk about that more specifically in another lecture.